Have you ever met someone who didn't seem human? I worked at a gas station for several years, and for most of that time, I did the night shift. I saw plenty of strange people, mostly those struggling with addiction or mental issues, but when I read your question, one man instantly came to mind. Our interaction lasted maybe 5 or 10 seconds. There's nothing dramatic about this story, and it must have happened nearly 10 years ago, but for some reason, it stuck with me. It was around 10 p.m., and the place was quiet. I saw an old car, maybe a Buick or something similar, pull up and park perpendicular to the parking spaces, engine still running, headlights on, and the driver's door wide open. An older man stepped out of the car and came inside. At first glance, he seemed normal, but I remember the texture of his skin vividly. It looked unnaturally tight, and his face had this fixed expression, like he was suppressing pain. He walked in a strange way, abrupt, quick movements, almost like a hurried zombie. When he looked at me, I noticed his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, almost white. The instant our eyes met, I felt a cold shiver run straight through my chest. My stomach dropped, and I got goosebumps all over. It was pure, instinctive fear. He walked up to the counter and asked me for directions to a place I had never heard of in my life. In a small town of only about 2,500 people, that was impossible. I couldn't help him, so I just let him go. He turned around and left exactly the way he came. The whole thing lasted seconds, nothing weird happened beyond that, his stiff movements, that unknown destination, and above all, the overwhelming sense that whatever I had just seen wasn't entirely human. That brief encounter left me deeply unsettled, and even though it happened years ago, it still sends chills down my spine. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to subscribe for more. Yes, and that person saved my life. I was 17 and working as a delivery driver for an Orange Julius Dairy Queen inside a mall. It was Christmas Eve, about 20 minutes before closing. The air was freezing, light snow was falling, and since I was a new driver, I was anxious to finish and head home before the weather got worse. While I was wiping down the counters, I noticed a tall, very thin man stepping out of an employees-only door between Foot Locker and the Buckle. Right away, something about him felt profoundly strange. He looked like a young man in his early 20s, wearing an oversized brown three-piece suit that looked like he'd dug it out of his grandfather's closet. He wasn't wearing shoes or socks. He ran straight to the counter, and his almost unreal appearance froze my blood. His hair was shoulder-length and copper-colored, and his eyes were a light brown, almost golden, like burnt honey. His skin was pale and unnaturally smooth, without a single pore, giving him an androgynous kind of beauty that would normally have stunned me. But that night, I felt a sudden, overwhelming fear for no apparent reason. He tapped his long, immaculate fingernails on the counter and said sharply, "Ah. So it's you?" in a tone of annoyance. I asked what he wanted to order. He made a dismissive noise and replied that he didn't want anything because everything was disgusting. Feeling uneasy, I told him I was going to call security. He pulled out a pocket watch, looking agitated and nervous, and said, "Go ahead. Call them, and make sure they walk you to your car." Without another word, he turned around and went back through the employees-only door. Of course, I called security and asked them to escort me to my car. I had parked in the employee section, way out in the back of the lot where there were hardly any vehicles. As we approached my car, 3 people dressed in dark clothing suddenly bolted out from behind it, where they had been crouching. They saw the security guard and ran off in panic. I have no doubt they were waiting for me, or for someone else who worked there. That encounter is the reason I follow this forum and why I became fascinated by the strange and unexplained. That man wasn't human. I don't know what he was. When I was about 12 or 13, I'm 22 now, I went to a very large church with my uncle and my sister. We sat down, calmly took in the place, and just enjoyed the atmosphere. I started to pray with my eyes closed, since a few weeks earlier we had lost a family member and I was still processing the grief. Suddenly, I noticed a flash, like from a camera, through my eyelids. I opened my eyes and saw a man, probably around 28 to 32 years old, taking pictures of me while I was praying. I was completely confused. Why the hell was this man photographing me? My uncle, who has always had a strong temperament, stood up and asked him angrily what he thought he was doing. But the man looked surprised and reacted in a strangely cheerful, almost euphoric way. He explained to my uncle that he had never heard of churches before, had never seen anyone praying to a higher being, and found the whole thing fascinating and entirely new. Out of caution, we decided to leave before the situation escalated. As we were walking out, my uncle muttered that he couldn't tell if the man was trying to provoke us or if he was just completely lost. That was the last we talked about it, until a few months later, when it came up again during a family gathering with uncles, parents, sisters, and cousins. My uncle dismissed it quickly, saying that the man must have been some kind of evil spirit or demon, because he had felt a strange, powerful energy coming from him. Even now, I can't shake how unsettlingly real that moment felt. His presence seemed to distort everything around him, like the world went slightly out of focus, and only he remained perfectly clear. It was almost like something straight out of a cinematic video game scene. I used to work as a valet at a well-known casino and resort in the Midwest. One day, I attended to a customer who only stayed for about an hour, something very unusual for someone like him. He was a single man, probably between 35 and 40 years old, with jet black hair and a completely black suit. He arrived around noon or maybe 1 in the afternoon. We always expected people like him to spend several hours inside the casino, but he was there only briefly before leaving. The first thing I noticed about him was his face, clearly uncanny, like he was stuck in a valley where human features just don't quite line up right. When I greeted him to take his car, I almost had to do a double take. His smile and words were polite, but his eyes were dead. When he smiled, they stayed motionless and lifeless. When he wasn't smiling, they opened unnaturally wide, full of intensity that didn't match the total relaxation of the rest of his face. It was impossible not to feel a chill. When I handed him back his keys, he made some odd remark about the casino's clientele. I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was a tone of disdain in it, like he didn't care much for the kind of people who came there. Then he got into his car and left. Later, during my break, several coworkers mentioned how disturbing he'd seemed. The casino had a pretty advanced facial recognition system, and the next day, one of the security supervisors created a profile to add the man to their database. Normally, that's where things would end. The surveillance department worked completely independently and rarely interacted with the rest of the staff. However, I had a friend from high school who worked in surveillance, and one day she told me something strange. They had a match on that man, and it turned out to be a woman. She explained that when they searched the archives, the software had perfectly identified the same bone structure as that of a female guest who had visited the casino alone several years earlier. The match was so precise that they couldn't dismiss it as a system error. According to her, they compared both recordings and found no visible similarities, no features in common, except for the identical facial structure recognized by the program. For a long time after that, we nicknamed him the Visitor. Some even joked, half seriously, that he might be the one himself, though no one dared to say the actual name. Nobody ever figured out if that person was human or something else entirely, but his presence alone was unsettling enough that every valet who worked that shift still remembers him to this day. I used to work for an oil company up in the North Slope of Alaska, where in winter they build ice roads that stretch hundreds of kilometers deep into the tundra. One January night, with the polar darkness covering everything, we finished some geological tests at a well about 100 kilometers west of Alpine and started heading back to camp. It was around 4 in the morning, though in that endless darkness, time meant nothing. We were driving about 40 kilometers per hour, our truck's headlights slicing through the frozen road ahead. Then, in the distance, we saw a figure, a tall, thin man, dressed in jeans, a sweatshirt, and, unbelievably, barefoot in temperatures around -20 degrees Celsius. Neither his posture nor his sluggish, dragging gait looked anything like an Inuit hunter. Something about him was deeply out of place. When we stopped beside him, he didn't even lift his head. He just walked past us in silence, continuing down the icy road as if we weren't there. Through my window, I caught a faint, sour, metallic smell. My co-worker in the back, trying to help, lowered the window and reached out to touch the man's arm. That was a mistake. In an instant, the man turned, grabbed his arm with inhuman strength, and glared at us with an expression of raw, primal fury. His face was pale and perfectly sculpted, almost lifeless in its symmetry, but his eyes were blazing with rage. He let out a scream, more like a roar, so deep and furious that it froze my blood. I slammed the accelerator. The truck skidded across the ice before finally gaining traction and speeding off into the darkness. Heart pounding, we reached the security outpost about 50 kilometers later. When my co-worker rolled up his sleeve, we saw a massive bruise in the exact shape of a hand. The guards, skeptical but concerned, organized 12-hour patrol along the road. They found nothing, no tracks, no traces, not even a hint of movement in the snow. We returned to camp in complete silence. Whatever that man, or that thing, was, it vanished without a sign. And ever since that night, every time the wind howls across the tundra, I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, waiting beyond the darkness. I used to work as a therapist and mental health case manager. I'm now disabled, but during those years, I had clients, and even relatives of clients, who gave me that same eerie feeling. But there was one case that genuinely frightened me. He was a 19-year-old transitioning from the youth services program into adult care, and I was his new case manager. From the very beginning, he became obsessed with getting a copy of his clinical records and refused to sign any other paperwork until he had them. It was an unusual and complicated request. I had to escalate it to my supervisors for approval, but I explained the process to him and told him I'd call once his records were ready. When he finally left my office, I felt this immense sense of relief. The room always felt so empty after he was gone, like he'd somehow drained all the energy out of it. He never broke eye contact the entire time, and his stare was so intense it made my skin crawl. The next day, he showed up again at the exact same time. I didn't have any other appointments, so I had to meet with him. The same thing happened, that same awful feeling of complete emptiness. "I want my records," he said, holding my gaze with this strange half-smile. I repeated that it would take a bit longer. He just kept staring at me, smiling slightly, for nearly a full minute. Then he stood up and walked out. And the next day, he came again, same time. He startled me badly, and then he did it again the day after that. Thank God, by then the paperwork was finally ready. When I handed it to him, he grabbed my hand firmly, forcing a handshake, and gave me that same unnerving look, the same piercing eyes, the same faint smile. "Good job," he said, and walked out. I never saw him again. He stopped answering my calls about arranging his social services, and to this day, I still can't explain why his presence left me feeling so completely drained and unsettled. Although some of them might seem harmless, my general theory is that prolonged contact with entities from another dimension is always like a pact with the devil. It often brings some kind of benefit, luck, charisma, strength, whatever, but it also demands a price. Dealing with them is like playing with fire. You might gain something from it, like success in business, but the essence of that exchange is forever tainted. I served a long federal sentence alongside some of the most dangerous inmates in the country. I didn't see as many infected people as one might think, but the most striking examples I ever encountered were before prison, back when I was still working. If you spend enough time in the darker corners of the world, it's inevitable that you'll run into people who seem different. I have the gift, or the curse, of seeing these things as physical manifestations. It's as if they stand out from their surroundings, there's no way to ignore them. Some appear to be permanently or partially co-piloted. There are different degrees to it. Think of it like this: there might be a great painter, but sometimes it's not really him moving the brush. It's another force guiding his hand, his eye, or his mind at certain moments. Under that influence, true miracles can be born, but in most interactions, the entity or energy prefers to stay hidden. Most of the ones I've encountered are closer to what we would call a curse, or a demon. When we say someone is fighting their demons, from addiction to drugs, alcohol, or gambling, in some cases it's literal. Those people are actually living with demons. And they rarely look good. My theory is that they can't completely mask their true appearance. They might say clever things or act charming if you talk to them. But if you ever see someone whose arm looks like it's made of writhing snakes, or whose jaw is rotting with flies buzzing around their head, there's a reason for that. They don't choose to look that way, it's our brain trying to interpret something incomprehensible into the closest form it can recognize. Some people can hear, smell, or sense these presences. I have a sort of tactile awareness of them, and I'm sure there are other sensory ways to confirm that you've crossed paths with something like that. The most terrifying part is that these entities can inhabit people close to you, spouses, co-workers, parents, siblings, and it's never considered real. Everything gets dismissed as mental illness or psychological issues. But I've worked with the mentally ill, and I've seen these other things. They're not the same. Some of the most severe patients I treated in prison had stranger encounters than any demonic possession described in their diagnoses, like the man who seemed to communicate with other beings through a mirror, though no one could explain how. They labeled him insane, medicated him heavily, and sent him to therapy with no result. I believe some people invite these experiences consciously, and one key factor is a kind of consent. But those entities can twist or break the rules of consent through linguistic deception or other tricks, making certain individuals more vulnerable when they encounter something malevolent. You can go a long time without crossing paths with one of these presences. I hardly ever see them in my immediate surroundings anymore, but when one enters my circle, it always ends in catastrophe, because if you engage too much and let greed take over, things go very wrong. One constant is that these entities seek direct eye contact. If you come across one inhabiting a human body, know that they don't need that body to manifest, but it's the most common way. There's a kind of handshake of consent through prolonged eye contact. I don't fully understand how it works, it depends on how your mind is wired. But it leaves you vulnerable if you hold their gaze for too long. The best thing is not to face them directly. Glance at them from the corner of your eye. That part of the vision processes information faster, so they're easier to detect, at least for me. Probably because the distortions or vibrations they cause in the ether are picked up more easily that way. If you lock eyes with an entity, you might glimpse wonders from other worlds or gain divine knowledge, but also utter madness. I don't know how it works for everyone else, only for me. The longer the eye contact lasts, the stronger the depersonalization becomes. And it's not always negative, not all entities are harmful, and not all require a human host to manifest, though that's the most common case. As that depersonalization deepens, your consciousness begins to separate from your body's perspective. Maybe it has to do with light, or photons bouncing between fixed points, I'm no scientist. But once the consciousness slips, reality starts to feel alien, sometimes hostile, often mechanical, like a great spinning wheel. You might glimpse alternate realities, ultimate truths, or experience pleasures and pains beyond imagination. There's always the risk that it turns into a violent nightmare. My impression is that if you give up your mental footing, if you lose intellectual control, something else begins to steer. The fluidity of consciousness is like leaving your front door open in a dangerous neighborhood. You must stay alert and guarded if you suspect someone isn't entirely who they appear to be. And it can happen in an instant. Maybe you and your partner go to a cabin retreat in the woods. Some entities are bound to physical locations, others migrate, attach to people, follow entire bloodlines, or are summoned, and some can hide in ways you'd never notice. Evasion is one of their most common tactics. If you can see them, they can see you. Since most people can't perceive them, they quickly notice who can, and usually vanish temporarily, especially when others are around. There don't seem to be any fixed rules about all this. Every interaction carries a risk. My best advice? If you ever find yourself staring into someone's eyes and they make you feel something's wrong, look away.